So hello everyone, thanks for joining us this evening with Sylvia Lavin, and presentation and discussion about her project and book recently published by Spector Books, Architecture Itself and Other Postmodern Effects. As you probably read the abstract of the event, but I will do just like a short introduction before we'll give the floor to Sylvia. So as you probably know, Sylvia Lavin is an internationally known critic, historian, and curator who has researched and explored architecture, art, and design across many historical periods. She received her Ph.D. from the Department of Art and Archaeology at Columbia University in 1990. Her books include Quatremère de Quincy and the Invention of a Modern Language of Architecture from 1992, and Forms Follows Libido, Architecture and Richard Neutra in a Psychoanalytic Culture from 2005, both published by the MIT Press. Kissing Architecture, published in 2011, Flash in the Pan, published in 2014, and most recently, Architecture Itself and Other Postmodernization Effects, published in 2020. Next to this, Sylvia is an active curator. She has curated this exhibition at CCA in Montreal in 2018, and for example, Everything Glues Will Land, which was one of the main components of the Pacific Standard Time series in 2013-2014, among others. She has also prepared and curated several exhibitions at the Princeton School of Architecture, where she currently serves as a professor of architecture. Prior to this, she was director of the Critical Studies and Master and PhD program at the Department of Architecture and Urban Design at UCLA. And she has, of course, taught at numerous institutions and has been recognized by many grants and awards, including Getty Research Institute or Graham Foundation. She is also the recipient of a 2011 Arts and Letters Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Today, we will discuss Sylvia's new book, Architecture Itself and Other Postmodernization Effects, as I already mentioned, based on the exhibition at CCA. Both the exhibition and the book put together images, drawings, models, fragments, different ephemera such as letters, business cards, books, magazines, and so on. So various objects in a sort of, I would say, collage. Or to me, the book itself or the catalog itself is almost an exhibition in a book, creating connection between the collected materials, which is very nice, nicely put in the graphic design, blurring distinctions between images, footnotes, and text. The book tries to counterread postmodern architecture and postmodernism in general, to challenge our notion and understanding of an autonomous or genius architect, as Sylvia describes in the book, and the discipline itself from historical, institutional, or geographical perspective, both in theory and practice, and trace, define, and explain the impact of what Sylvia calls postmodernization on architecture and, of course, in a broader sense, on related fields. So thanks for joining us, Sylvia, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and for that gracious introduction. So I thought I would give you a little bit, let's say, the backstory. The book is a culmination of a whole series of sort of research projects that I've undertaken under the last, I don't know, 8-10 years, something like that. While I think of it as hopefully making a contribution to the historiography of late 20th century architecture, I hope that it also makes a contribution to this, let's say, relatively new medium, which is the research exhibition. So it's how it does that, maybe, that I will focus on. So you'll let me, oh, wait a minute, hang on a second. I have to share my screen, just one second. Okay, can somebody give me a thumbs up that it works? Great, thank you. Okay, so the project began about 10 years ago or so, while I was visiting a professor at Princeton. And I'm somebody who likes to take advantage of the things that are around me. And I decided that I would start looking at some things related to the history of late 20th century architecture in Princeton. One of them being Peter Eisenman's House 1. So this is an addition to a suburban, like a very undistinguished suburban house, which for many people is the site of a kind of trigger of what has historically been called postmodernism. So I took some students there. I thought I would also go look at one of Michael Graves's early commissions, which is also in Princeton, which is to say Princeton, New Jersey was the center of a kind of American postmodernism. People were teaching there, for various reasons. It's interesting to note that the person who commissioned this house from Graves was a member of the faculty at Princeton, but he was working in administration in the late 1960s. And in fact, he was the person who was principally responsible for bringing women students to the campus for the first time. So it's important to sort of keep your historical imagination on thinking about what was happening in 1967, 1968 in Princeton. So it was this kind of thing. A few years later, a young architect named Jesse Reiser was a student at the Cooper Union under the direction then of John Haydock. And there was a visiting professor by the name of Aldo Rossi, who walked by Jesse's desk and was riveted by the little mechanical models of airplanes that Jesse had made with a bunch of very American metallic paint. And Rossi hired Jesse, took him off to Milan and had him produce this drawing in what Rossi later would famously call American colors. So Jesse at this is now on the faculty at Princeton. So in other words, being in Princeton for me was a kind of reminder of the American history of postmodernism. Even now, somebody like Michael Meredith of Moss is on the faculty there. And, we're back to pitched roofs and a kind of historical typology. So it all seemed to be happening again. In any case, in some sense of inquisitiveness, I took a group of students a few years ago to House 1. And this is what I found. So in a kind of revenge, if you will, of the traditional postmodern, a school in China now owns Peter Eisenman's House 1, and it has set up the Princeton School there, where it brings Chinese students to New Jersey who somehow imagine that they're going to the university. And instead of going to the university, they end up in this funny house in the middle of no place. So having students there clearly led this school to decide that there was something dangerous about Eisenman's house. Not a danger of the kind, the metaphysical kind that he imagined, but rather a very banal kind of danger, like that you might actually fall off a stair. Now, I don't know whether you can see, but on the lower right of the image, you see that they put this handrail, which you can buy for about $1.50 at the local Home Depot. So they went to the local hardware store, picked up the most antithetical to Peter Eisenman handrail you could possibly imagine, nailed that thing to the floor. And if you see, it is literally one step above the floor. So they were clearly extremely worried, and it worried enough that they would do this. So anyway, I was fascinated by this, and I wondered what kind of archive did this totally bizarre concatenation of handrails constitute. So I went back to the drawings. You know, these are Peter's famous drawings, you know, the cube. And I'm sure you've seen these drawings a million times. And, you know, House 1 is the one that started this idea of syntax versus semantics, of transformation, of iteration, of abstraction, all of the things that you well know in relation to Eisenman. Now, if you look closely, the stair where they put the handrail is the one on the lower right of the image. And you'll see in the drawing, this drawing anyway, there is no handrail. So I then started to go, well, was there a handrail? Is the handrail original? How do I understand the history of the handrail in Peter Eisenman? So I started looking around, and I thought, okay, well, let's look at House 6 because there are famously multiple stairs. This is a very famous image of House 6, and I thought, gosh, I don't know whether there's a handrail. Actually, there wasn't a handrail, as you can see from the very early renovation. This renovation is already from the early 1970s, where the owners were totally terrified that some child would fall off the stair. So in went this plexiglass wall. So you hear me circling around the idea that a handrail is one of the ways that architecture manages its responsibility to life safety. And without a handrail, it's almost as though Eisenman was suggesting that life itself was a kind of metaphysics, not something that required architectural protection. And I will also add, by the way, that there were in fact no requirements for handrails inside domestic architecture in New Jersey until the mid-1970s, which is to say that if you wanted to kill yourself on your own staircase, you were more than welcome to. It only became a problem when a legal system got put in place and people started worrying about somebody else dying on your staircase. And that's when handrails were regulated. So I went on a scavenger hunt for handrails. This is in fact exactly the handrail from House 6, which has been preserved, extracted and preserved by its current owner. And this original handrail ended up in the staircase, ended up in the exhibition with the red stair placed above it, creating this a kind of virtual mirror. But back to the handrail. So one of the things that this little, kind of site visit, if you will, started a kind of intellectual process for me of trying to think about what happened when the abstractions of postmodernism met the legal conditions governing architectural practice in the late 1960s. What were the mechanisms for managing not the image of architecture, but its materialization? So if you're interested in this, this would then require you to take a look at a totally separate archive, a body of drawings that Eisenman himself never published because they are concerned with things like clients, of which you see the two of them there, and they are concerned with things like handrails. So the person at the top here is very generously protected from falling to their death by a very thin handrail. So The handrail in question that I started with is just to the right of this stair. And I was extremely struck by this particular drawing because it is a woman sitting in front of a fireplace. Eisenman famously claimed to have eliminated from all residential architecture the leftover metaphysics of domesticity, which in American architecture is above all the fireplace. So I was very surprised to see a fireplace. And I called Eisenman and I said, what were you doing with the fireplace? I just couldn't believe my eyes. And he said, no. There was no fireplace in the house. There was a fake fireplace. I tricked the client into believing that there was a fireplace when in fact there was not. Actually, it was Eisenman who was tricked because indeed there was an operable fireplace. But let's say that Eisenman so believed his own metaphysics that he literally risked not only allowing people to fall to their deaths, but risked letting the house catch on fire. Because here the contractor writes to him in this note, Peter, get the stair out of the fireplace. So in effect, at every moment in which this architecture of abstraction came into contact with things like life, heat, energy, etc., the architecture itself was at the risk of conflagration. Now, as luck would have it, the next time I went to the house, the owners of the Chinese school had decided to get rid of the handrails. The original handrails had been pulled out of house one, and I found them sitting on the grass. And I have to say, I suppose I'm a very bad art historian, because it wasn't until they were taken out of the house, in other words, when they were turned into fragments and their own kind of abstraction, that I noticed something to me, very peculiar about them. I had imagined white tubular steel. I thought of these as classic Le Corbusier handrails. But then when they were out against the green, I noticed that in fact, the spacing between the handrails is not regular in a Corb way, but rather it's divided into thirds, which is to say that the handrail itself is organized around the proportions of the golden section. So this most banal thing, a handrail, and I could also add, Eisenman figured out on all the rest of his houses never to have a handrail again. He figured out how to meet code by burying things in walls and so forth. This handrail actually follows the abstraction of the lines that you see in the drawings, and is in that sense, if you remember your classicism, the idea of ex ungue leonem, that if you had a small part of a classical temple, you ought to be able to construct the whole because of the systems of proportion. This, in fact, was what Eisenman was doing. So this began for me an interest in the material and professional practices of what is still without much substance called postmodernism. So postmodernism is the word that is used to hold together this sort of loose set of styles. And I became interested instead in trying to examine what happens when that set of stylistic categories is pushed aside in favor of thinking about the material history of the profession. So, as I'm sure many of you know, that the oldest exhibitions of architecture are exhibitions of fragments. They began in the 18th century in France. And so I went on a hunt for fragments. So this building by Bob Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, which no longer exists, was relatively well known to have had these enamel panels taken off And they're around, some of them are at the Museum of Modern Art. Here you can see just before the building was demolished that they were going around. So I became interested in these panels, in the history of the panels, about which Venturi had said he wanted to design them like wallpaper. So Venturi is a good historian. He knew well the history of wallpaper and the history of modern wallpaper. These are the famous wallpapers by Le Corbusier. When these papers were made, the manufacturer took several of Corb's paintings and matched the wallpaper samples to the color in the paintings. So in effect, this wallpaper system was a kind of machine to turn the entire interior of a house into a Le Corbusier painting. So Bob Venturi starts on this elaborate process where he's sending around bits and pieces of wallpaper, like Le Corbusier's wallpaper, which he is trying to get manufacturers to make into these panels. So for several years, these things are traveling around and he's trying to get the color. He really sounds like an artist. They're arguing, is it red? Is it magenta? Is it pink? You know, this the vocabulary of color, of course, being so related to a traditional notion of art. So on February 9th, 1979, he gets a letter from the manufacturer, which finally says, regretfully, we cannot make this color. That's the end of the color. And he writes with his characteristic red pencil, shit, quoi faire? Like, what am I to do? It's as though the je ne sais quoi of color, the language of French aesthetics, was replaced by the language of French frustration. What the fuck am I going to do now? He says. So actually, it turns out that the choice is not his. For the next series of letters that go back and forth between him and the manufacturer are based on a series of Pantone chips. So in the early 1970s, Pantone had just been established, in fact, not very far from Philadelphia. And instead of Venturi imagining himself to be an artist who could select a color, instead, he was given color chips from which to select. So in an early, let's call it a kind of digitization of color, the two things that should have nothing to do with one another, right? The je ne sais quoi of color on the one hand, and the logic of color production come together in this work to dictate the color of the final panels. And when you look at this image, again, I showed it to you before, but then you start to notice, for example, that the cars and the panels and the sign, they're all the same color, even though they're all made by different manufacturers, because now everybody's dealing with the same Pantone chip. I'm sure you know that Pantone was developed as a print technology. It was to enable printing presses and designers to work across long distances. So even though we think about postmodernism in relation to signage and so forth, this building was actually made using the technology of contemporary print. Another set of fragments that I was interested in working with are these Sono tubes, the cardboard tubes that had been used during the 1984 Olympic Games. They were part of a kind of messaging system, if you will, that were spread around LA. I'm not going to go into these in a lot of detail, but this is just to say the 1980 Olympic Games were the first games that were significantly televised. In fact, that more of the audience was a televisual audience than anything else. This is the first Olympic Games in which nothing permanent was built, and instead these Sono Tubes were used to mobilize the city of Los Angeles. So, because they had venues all over the place. If you have venues all over the place, you all of a sudden produce in the city during the Olympic Games a traffic nightmare. And one of the most important and long-lasting effects of the '84 Olympic Games was a urban-wide computer communication system regulating traffic, regulating the flow of human beings, and so forth. So that color coding that you see in the Sono Tubes was actually embedded in a complex urban scale media system for the first time. So there are lots of different things that we might think of as a fragment or a primary object that one could collect. Photographs are amongst them, but there are others as well. So during the course of this research, I went off to the Deutsche Architecture Museum. I'm sure many of you have been there. And you may know the first catalog that was published when Klotz opened the museum, which is sort of one of the what would you call it, institutions of record when it comes to the history of the postmodern. So this photograph forms the cover of this catalog, and there are images on it: Hausrucker, Venturi, Botta, Natalini, Stanley Tigerman. There are all kinds of things on this. So one of the models that I found the most fascinating was this one. Let's see. It is on the lower right. I don't know if you see the column. This is the Venturi column. Two behind it, long to the right. That's this model, which is Frank Gehry's house in Santa Monica. Now, if you know anything about Gehry's architecture and his model making techniques, you might scratch your head and think, this does not look much like a Gehry model. Actually, it kind of looks like a German train maker made it. It does not look at all like a Gehry model. And in fact, this is what the Gehry model looks like. It's quite schizophrenic, right? I mean, it's a sort of bizarre that you would find this in an archive called the Gehry model. Well, the history of what happened here was that Klotz, along with just a few other players, were out buying models and drawings from pretty much anybody they could get their hands on. They established a market. Private collectors came in and raised the prices so high that very few institutions could any longer afford to purchase these models. In fact, the Angewandte Kunst in Vienna bought this model, and instead of building a collection, they bought one. And what Klotz decided to do, because he couldn't own that one, is that he just had somebody make one. Let's just make a model, because it's a little bit like a photo documentation process. The Museum of Modern Art had a famous show on the best buildings for best, and one of which I showed you. And essentially what happened at that exhibition was that the museum, how would I put it politely, rented its gallery spaces to the corporation in order to have them display their wares. In the 1980s, no member of the museum staff was allowed to take fees for doing special curatorial work. So In other words, Best wanted to pay MoMA to do an exhibition on their own work. MoMA was not allowed to do that, but they did it anyway. And as payment, they established what they called the Best Model Fund. So the Best Corporation donated money to the Museum of Modern Art. And the very first model they made was the model of Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. So this may look like a modern building, but in fact, it is a postmodern model, if you will, made through this complex series of negotiations between the museum, the corporation, and the architect. So I was really interested in this fabrication, this collection. Museums are, at least historically, we think of museums as where, as a conserver of history, of the place in which authentic historical archives are held. But it turns out that they are amongst the first appropriation artists, if you will, of the postmodern. So I did a series of exhibitions that explored the relationship between the facsimile, the facsimile, and let's call it the original model. So this is a small show that took place at Princeton. What you're looking at here is a restaging of that original photograph, although all of the models that you see are the historic ones borrowed from Germany. While at the Chicago Architecture Biennial, I made a model of the Ungers Museum and had paper copies of the copies produced inside. And when you look through, what you're seeing is the Princeton gallery at the same time. So this question of the real and the original were put into a kind of a dialogue. So two things then I tried to do sort of at the same time, just before the CCA show opened. One was to try to think about the history of the postmodern as a series of fragments. And if you put them together, what kinds of new histories could be produced on the one hand, and on the other hand, I worked hard to try to think about the archive as something that you could make available simultaneous with the fragments, so that each fragment could in effect unfold into its own micro history. So I'll just show you a few images of the exhibition as it appeared at the CCA. So this is the entryway into the exhibition, and you see in the middle ground of the image a chipboard model. This was a model recreation of, in fact, a historic show that Eisenman had done at the CCA some years before. So it's a kind of model of a historic model with models inside. Of course, one of the things that the CCA had done was kept as fragments some of the original things. So we put that, here you see that as a detail. When the CCA added its new building and renovated the Shaughnessy House, they, of course, meticulously documented the process, including the extraction of fragments. So the exhibition was organized around several categories, one of them being this institutional history that I was describing about museums and archives and so forth, sort of planting artificial objects in their midst. Another room was concerned with visualization technologies and information technologies. So, of course, here are those same Sono Tubes, but also some early uses of digital tools for a variety of things, printing, Disney, carpets, making paintings out of algorithms, and using early CAD to imagine the Piazza d'Italia on the left. Another gallery was about research methodologies, the kinds of sites that architects were going to, the kinds of knowledge production tools they developed. I was particularly interested in the way scholarly research, like going to the library and that kind of thing, became part of the architect's toolkit as far as I was aware for the first time. Another room was about the history of exhibition and commercial galleries and different forms of, let's call it monetization of architecture, whether through the selling of once technical artifacts or through the invention of new kinds of materials. This is a brick unit developed by an American developer architect in the late 60s and early 70s, and you can see how the wall would have been made. Was interested in revisiting the analogy between buildings and bodies, a very well-known trope of the period, a trope that often does not address the kinds of body politics that architecture was undergoing in that period. And then, of course, to conclude, the history of drawing in that period, since it's such an important part of its self-image. So the last step in this long process was the production of the book, and in part to signal that it's not really a catalog of an exhibition, but a separate project. I slightly changed the title. I'll tell you about what's on the cover in just a moment, but the book is not, even though there's only my name on the cover, there are other names on the back. All of these were collaborative efforts, but the book has many texts by other people as well, because if we go back to the beginning, I really think of the book as not the ending, but hopefully the opening of a new conversation. There are lots of documents. It's a kind of archive where people could go and do their own work. What you're looking at here on the cover is the back of a drawing by John Haydock of his renovation of the Cooper Union. One of the things that Haydock did while he was renovating the Cooper Union was to, quote, discover a very unusual steel beam system in the mid-19th century building. And in the basement of the Cooper Union, who knew, there are all of these 19th century beams that Haydock preserved. So he was really working as much as a historic preservationist, if you will, as an architect. So here you can see a little bit, as was being mentioned, about how the book works, where there's a running numbering system between footnotes and images to try to bring these things together. On the lower right, it's one of the first drag and drop designs made on an Apple computer. This is by Morphosis. Morphosis was given an early, an Apple II, a LisaDraw machine in order to do bookkeeping. And instead of doing bookkeeping, Tom Main decided that he would try it as a drawing tool. So this is what you see here. Some of the drawing techniques that interested me the most were the ones that I was the least familiar with. So nobody could not recognize the Michael Gravesian colors of the lower left image. What maybe in this image is a little hard to tell is that Graves is drawing directly on a Xerox. So when his office got big enough and he wanted to enter competitions from all over the world, but didn't have time to go, he would make Xeroxes of buildings in Turkey and here and there, and then color them in to make it look as though he had been there. So this kind of inauthentic authenticity, just like we saw at the museums. One of my absolute favorite things that's in the book is this. So what you are looking at is a ceiling plan, if you will, of one of the dolphin fountains at the Disney Hotel in Florida. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the Graves working drawings is, of course, like one of the things that's fascinating about all these guys is that they totally believe their own mythology. So the Graves office absolutely believed that even a working drawing had to be drawn meticulously by hand. Then they got to a point, however, that not even they could keep up that level of production, but they had produced a kind of architecture, a figurative architecture that was very hard to replicate, let's say, automatically. So this drawing on the left, the fins, do they call them fins? I guess they're fins, or flipper of the dolphin. It's actually made out of stickers that they put down 4 different times on the paper. They applied it to the vellum in order to try to mechanize what was in fact supposed to be a handmade technique. Mapping, they were all extremely interested in mapping. The image on the top is an image, part of which you know well. This is from the Venturi Scott Brown Learning from Las Vegas studio. This part of this map is reproduced many, many times, but what is not usually reproduced is the entire map. And you see it's actually a model of the strip in Las Vegas because it turns the corner on the left. There are all kinds of important map making technologies that were essential to this period, including the well-known Susan Lacey 3 Weeks in May, in which Suzanne and a group of her colleagues stamped a map of Los Angeles with the word rape every time a rape got every time a rape took place within the confines of the city of Los Angeles, which is to say this is a statistical map, constantly updated statistical map that was shown in front of the police department of downtown LA. Finally, just because this is an exhibition, I thought I would remind you here, you're looking at one of the Castelli shows where you have Rossi and Cedric Price. You have all of these people who should have been ideologically absolutely at odds with one another, whose opposition, ideological opposition, if you will, was neutralized by the space of the gallery. So I'll just end with this image that shows a flattened version of the cover of the book, where the back of the drawing is on the front and the front of the drawing is on the back. And this wonderful little statement by Hayduck saying that these drawings cannot be circulated because they're just to raise money for the building. And before the drawings can circulate, they have to be designed. So drawings at this point are very far from their traditional role as a system of communication, and they are instead, let's call it a system of counterfeit. Thank you. So that's a long, you're muted.
So thank you for this presentation. Before we start the open discussion, You can write your comments or questions either in the Q&A section of the Zoom, or you can just start your video, raise your hand, and ask directly. But before we start, we also prepared a few start questions. So,
yeah. So I will pose the first one. Thank you, Sylvia, for the presentation. I would just get back to the title of your book, which is Architecture Itself. And I wanted to ask, because you use the term and you say that the term architecture itself served as a useful tool to develop a myth of postmodern architecture. Could you please explain to those who didn't read the book why you chose architecture itself?
Well, so architecture itself is one of those phrases that is used to end conversation, I guess is what I would say. So I think one of the historical truisms about postmodernism is that it was a discursive era and it was all about producing discourse. So if you're interested in discourse, you then also have to be interested in the moments in which discourse fails or actually is commanded to stop. So if you listen to architects, you will, especially when they're having a debate, one of them will inevitably say, well, but that's not architecture itself. And so there's this reference to the thing that cannot be defined that I came to the conclusion was actually the most important, still unexamined legacy of what we have historically called the postmodern. It asserts an indefinable, unverifiable essence. It used to be called mediums, what Clement Greenberg would call medium, or what later was called discipline. I mean, there is the history of these terms meant to describe the indescribable. And the one that was favored by the postmodernists was this kind of Kantian, the thing itself, the thing as such. These are the kinds of terms that you hear. And it seems to me that those are the kinds of formulations that are called on exactly at the moment in which the self-evident nature of the thing at hand is no longer self-evident. So since you actually don't know what it is, you have to come up with a formulation to pretend not only that you do, but to define that thing as something that is beyond interrogation. So that's, at the beginning, I thought of that as a kind of myth, like that there was this thing called postmodernism, which was a myth. In the original title of the exhibition, you hear the echo of Rosalind Krauss's famous originality and other modernist myths. If originality was the primary mythological structure of the modern, I would say architecture itself is the primary mythological structure of the postmodern in architecture.
Thank you. I think you try to demystify the architecture itself, and through the evidence you got from archives, you found some very, sometimes even funny examples. What would be your favorite example of this myth that you found?
Well, I will say that the drawing of Bob Venturi's drawing with the Pantone chips on it, it is maybe one of my all-time favorites. I mean, I have to say, I became a little obsessed with lined paper. The way architects of this period started to use lined paper, like like legal paper. And I wasn't really sure, maybe because it's sort of administrative and bureaucratic looking or legal looking, I was interested in it. But really in the by the late 1960s, architects were using that kind of paper instead of notebooks, instead of artist notebooks. So instead of going around and sketching on a blank page in a notebook that held together, they were doing things with this lined paper. And one of the reasons is because many of them were not just going to a site, but they were also going to a library, and they were also going to a client meeting. So the lined paper, which enables writing as much as drawing, completely reshifted the valence and value of putting pen to paper. So a lined paper makes it possible to write and draw simultaneously in a way that the artist's notebook, a little bit harder. Michael Graves did all kinds of insane things. Of course, you know, because Michael ended up making a kind of living off of his notebooks and his artist sketches. So he had to invent this super complicated way of copying himself in order to make these notebooks. But at any rate, so on the one hand, the lined paper is itself a demystification machine. Like, I don't have to do it. Like, they did it all by themselves. But the thing that I like about the one that I showed you is that in its own way, Venturi was still just a little bit disobedient, because the paper is supposed to be vertical. And when he made that drawing with the Pantone chips, he turned it on the horizontal, which is to say that he turned the logic of the bureaucratic sequence on its side and created a kind of collage, if you will. He made a collage out of his own artistic defeat. That's what happened, right? So he entered that project imagining that he was an artiste like Le Corbusier, where he could design his wallpaper and that they would come and let him select his colors and so forth. And instead, he got disciplined into the logic of production, which was now being determined by Pantone, a kind of, you know, think of it as the early Photoshop, just like absolutely everything being collapsed into this thing. But he found one very small gesture of disobedience. And I suppose I appreciate that.
Thank you. And maybe I will have the last question, and then we can give voice to others. My last question would be, you work with Frederick Jameson in your book, the book Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, and that this book places architecture into the system of late capitalism. Did you think about the comparison with postmodernism or postmodernization in late socialist state systems, as Czechoslovakia was? Maybe it would be a nice comparison.
Yeah, it would be a great comparison. And now that reminds me. So, because you know, an archive has to be open, I've been trying to think about how to keep this open. So the CCA and I are going to be organizing a series of conversations with scholars from other areas in order to bring more geographies into the story than I was able to manage myself, right? So, for example, there's a huge, quote, postmodernism movement in the Middle East. I don't read Arabic, that's beyond my capacity. There was a lot of quote unquote postmodern, not a lot, but there was quite a bit in Japan, but also in China. What this looked like there is something that I think would be, you know, important. In socialist countries, I mean, I would be certainly eager to know more than I do about this. You know, it's funny, Americans of my generation know what very, very little we know about modern architecture in Prague because of Michael Graves's fascination with Plečnik and that whole movement. So the interest in a kind of late classicism, how would I put it? The American view of it sucked the socialism out of Eastern Europe, right? So it would be super interesting to try to understand what was happening in socialist countries. I just can't imagine that this would have been seen as anything but decadent and horrible, which I suppose it was in many ways. I think that the only thing that I would say about Jameson in particular is that I think of the agency as the reverse, which is to say, I think that Jameson was interested in only in seeing in the postmodern a reflection of late capitalism. And I think it's just as interesting to think about whether aspects of the structure of late capitalism were actually modeled on architecture. So if you think of his famous interest in the Bonaventure Hotel, for example, he makes certain assumptions about how the building works that are actually just wrong. So, for example, he calls it a city within a city and that it's autonomous and so forth. Actually, this is not the case at all. It is one of the first buildings that was built through an international conglomeration of financing. But the reason that it was able to be built was that it managed to get the city of LA that wanted to develop that land to essentially pay for many of its services. So if you were to track the air conditioning, for example, like how is that building air conditioned? You're talking about a mirrored building in a city that is over 100 degrees for many, many, many months of the year. So air conditioning would have been key. And there's a massive air conditioning plant that's about 8 blocks away that is on public land and paid for by the city in order to attract this development. So the point is, it is not an autonomous thing. It is absolutely embedded in the financial logic of the city. In some ways, if more socialist than a certain kind of socialism in the sense that it's state-sponsored. This was much more state-sponsored than what you would normally think of as housing, just to take one example. So this is only to say that I've learned enough from looking at this period to know how little I know and to know how specific the way these building practices became when they intersected with local conditions, local codes, local technologies, local economies, and so forth. And I just don't know the situation that would have sort of governed production then, but I would imagine it would be very, very interesting.
Thank you. And maybe, does anybody have any question from the audience? Because nobody wrote into chat, so maybe you would like to speak directly. So nobody, so maybe I will use my questions that I prepared. So another question of mine was you use the term architecture itself with a kind of irony. And the fact that irony is the feature of postmodern architecture, this is what they taught us at school. Do you think that irony in architecture is another myth of postmodernization, or did it really exist let's say, in the approach of architects, maybe as a kind of bitter irony, that they were in a situation when architecture was deflated, and they were trying to get over the situation also using this kind of bitter irony. Do you think this is possible, or is it irony really embedded in the project of postmodern architecture?
Well, I'm not sure I was being ironic, in the sense that I still find it troubling the way the phrase is used. And so I wanted to take what has always been seen as irony and present it almost as a kind of desperation. And I'm not ironic about that. I think the desperation was, yeah, I guess I would prefer to not evaluate. So to call something ironic is to impute ulterior motives to something, right? So you're assuming that you know something that is being intended that is not being said. And I guess what I tried, for better or for worse, to do is to just stick with what was actually said and not to imagine that I knew what was being thought. I mean, this is now 50 years ago. I don't know what anybody was thinking. I just know what was being thought. So one of the reasons that I focused in the book, I focused a certain amount on a telegram by Colin Rowe, because a telegram is, there's no room for irony in a telegram. You know, you pay for every letter. You have to only say what you mean, no more, no less. And it was interesting to hear him feel that the entire historiography of modernism was going to succeed or fail on this basis, and on the basis of being able to assert that there was this thing called architecture itself. And I guess what I tried to argue is that in the first half of the 20th century, there were architecture brought with it, or maybe a better way, borrowed from industry, certain metrics, cost per square foot, for example. You know, if a building was inexpensive, you could consider it to be successful, or some notion of functionalism. If it satisfied its program requirements in an efficient way, it was considered successful. So let's say that up until maybe World War II, there were certain what we might call empirically verifiable metrics that went along with architecture. What happened after the war, in a lot of places, so I won't say everywhere, but certainly in the United States, and certainly in places like Italy and certain places that were very dependent on their understanding of America. After the Second World War, there was a sense that all of those empirical requirements had been met. That if you wanted to do an existence minimum kind of architecture based on industrial modes, not only of production, but of efficiency, that was no longer a theoretical question. That was a proven possibility. So one knew how to do that. What started to happen was that a whole new series of things were asked of architecture and of architects, like, make me happy. I mean, nobody in the 20s asked Tessenau or, Ernst might make me happy. Instead, there were other criteria: make me safe, make me warm, let me rest. And And so I think it was an enormous problem, if you will, for architecture when these unverifiable requests were being made of it, because then there would be no way to know whether you had succeeded. And so the very importance of architecture started to be ascribed to these things like make me happy, make me beautiful, make me rich, make me, you know, these series of a kind of fantasy projections that there was absolutely no way to verify whether they had been produced, satisfied or not. And architecture itself became a way of managing the aporia between these requests and the inability to know whether you had satisfied them or not. And to me, I think that's a kind of desperation. It's not ironic. It's not ironic. This is a little bit like that. That is a game that you can't win. You really can't win. And it's a little bit sad.
Yeah, maybe that's what I meant with like irony, because what they usually teach us at school when speaking about postmodern architecture is that postmodern architects use irony. But in your book, the only irony that I can see is as you said, maybe desperation, because the role of the architect can be somehow sorry to say it, or the role of architecture is very vague. And also the role of architect. What should architect do? Who is the architect? Is he developer? Is he artist, as you suggest? And maybe that's the desperate position. Maybe then there can be some irony about this desperation, but I can't see it in your book. That's what I want to say. So why do we still hear at school that postmodern architecture is connected to irony?
Well, okay. So why we still hear it and whether it was or wasn't are entirely different questions. You know, one of the things that post architects of that period, I'm sort of, I hate the word at this point, but one of the things that architects of that period started to become very good at is producing discourse around their own work. And it was formidably successful. And evidence of the success is that we still use their own words to describe what it is that they do. I mean, you know, I just can't even imagine that if you wanted to learn about, I don't know, if you wanted to learn about, I'm trying to think who would be, I don't know, Borromini, that you would ask him, like that he would be the last word on what it is that he would have to say about himself. I mean, I think of Borromini because he threw himself on a sword. So, I mean, the man was insane, let's say, right? By contemporary standards, he was a suicidal maniac, completely unable to manage his failure with Bernini or whatever it is that you would have to say. But the last person you would ask would be him. So, and this is what I was trying to say in the Eisenman story that I started with. And maybe there was some irony here. I guess I would say either this was irony or maybe a little mean-spirited. I try not to be mean, but it's kind of hard when you come across an outsized ego. But, you know, it was, I have to say, as a historian, it was quite extraordinary to be looking at a construction document showing me a working fireplace and listening to Eisenman say, oh no, I outsmarted her. It was not a working fireplace. And which is to say that Eisenman, over the course of 50 years, had come to believe his own story so profoundly that when confronted not only with evidence, but with his own evidence, it's not like I found a working drawing someplace else that was his working drawing. He's like, no, 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 no. So that is an extraordinary accomplishment, if you will, to have produced a narrative that is so all-encompassing, so believable, that the author believes it. So, when Trump and when the 4 year ago election was unfolding, God, I can barely even remember, there was a conversation about the difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump that went something like this. One of them is a bullshit artist, and the other is a liar. So those were our choices, a liar and a bullshit artist. And these were the differences as they came to be explained. So a liar is somebody who tells the not truth strategically. They know the difference between truth and falsehood. They make up a lie for a specific strategic reason. A bullshit artist is somebody who does not know the difference between a falsehood and a truth, does not care about the difference between a falsehood and a truth, and has utterly no strategic purpose other than momentary tactical advantage in a game with no end. So somehow the possibility that we would only have a choice between a liar and a bullshit artist, this is part of the kind of political reality that came to unfold through architectural discourse. So back in that period. So I would say postmodernism, and by the way, of course, Donald Trump, his main building, Trump Tower, is designed by an architect only because you're not good enough at postmodernism, do you not know? And his name was Dare Scott. And you have to reckon with this. Dare Scott was one of the most successful architects to have graduated from Yale University. This is not some asshole from no place. This is somebody from one of the top 3 schools of architecture. He was nothing less than the research assistant to Vincent Scully. So he is the apex of American postmodernism, and that's who Trump selected. So this is all oh, and by the way, you probably also know that Andy Warhol he loved Trump Tower. Was he ironic or not? He loved Trump Tower, made drawing after drawing of Trump Tower, and tried to sell Trump on his own Trump Tower, and Trump wouldn't buy them. So I don't know who got caught in that irony, because Trump is never anybody to have lose a good opportunity to make some money. So had he bought them, they would have quadrupled in value now. But Warhol never got over it. Warhol was unhappy till the day he died that Trump had not bought himself. Anyway, the point is that there was really a fundamental shift in the relationship between these institutions. What is Yale University doing? Producing somebody who does that. I mean, that's the end. For me, that's it. This is not ironic. This is a serious problem. What does it mean when the Museum of Modern Art is selling its galleries to a corporation and making replica models of modernist masterpieces to cover it up? I mean, this is not ironic. You hear zero irony in my tone.
So thank you. So we have a question from the audience, from Giacomo Palla from the University of Innsbruck. And the question is, if modernist architecture borrowed from industry, while in the postmodern we witness the kind of desperation mentioned before, how can today's situation be defined, particularly given the operative interest on postmodern architecture or the appreciation of certain disciplinary topics, maybe through object-oriented ontology? Isn't it quite interesting to find these kinds of interest, or retromania in quotation marks, even when there clearly are new technologies or possible new matrices? Is it a new architecture in itself, again in quote marks?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question with many different pieces in it. So certainly, triple O, as they like to call it here, is very much invested in the idea of a je ne sais quoi in the root of architecture, for sure. And it's interesting because the at least in this country, the folks that follow Harman the most are ones that do not appear to be postmodern, in the sense that they're much more about a kind of organic, super techno driven film effects, this kind of thing. So in the US, the triple O folks are not the ones that are doing historical typology and that kind of thing. There's more an Anglo-European Kirsten Gears, there's a big Dutch movement, the post MVRDV, Ben van Berkel, that, Dutch, Belgian, there's a big Flemish historicist thing. And it's happening the same way that it happened before, which is to say people working in historic city centers in Europe in particular, they can't tear things down. So they become a kind of fetishizers of historic preservation. So historic preservation is one area that operates quite differently today than it did in the 70s and 80s. So I would say we could look for a difference there. The object-oriented ontology is, in my view, unfortunately, a kind of retreat into a self-justifying notion of the discipline. Not that there couldn't be other things that are said about it, but again, I think of it as a kind of resisting discourse, I guess. On the new matrices, and I don't know, I mean, the contemporary scene strikes me as a little bit problematic, because then I think you also have people, some of them are parametric and some of them are not, that are absolutely trying to produce a verifiable architecture based on science and fact and data and so forth. So there's that. So if you look at those three things, the triple O, a kind of new empiricism, if you will, and a new historicism, the thing that is the scariest about them is it's exactly the range, right? So if you were to have looked at any one of the Castelli shows, you would have seen a similar division apparently the techno guy, you'd have Bernard Tschumi, or the ontologist, you'd have John Haydock or something like that, and the preservationist, you'd have Elder Rossi. And in fact, from the current perspective, what's important is what those figures had in common, not what divided them. So in response to Giacomo's excellent question, I would say, I think it's the job of the critic today, and now I'm speaking as a critic as opposed to a historian, the job of the critic today would be to find out what they have in common and not be seduced by what they apparently have that separates them. Because if we emphasize what separates them, we're going to end up saying, well, one is a liar and the other is a bullshit artist. I mean, these are just, they're not helpful, right? So the question would be, what are some of the, yeah, I mean, we should end in a moment, everybody. I'm sure it's very late for you, but I would just say, for example, one of the things that, not one of the issues that Giacomo raises have anything to say about climate, for example. Like, why is that? So do we want to think about those as a way for architecture to deal with the fact that for the last 20 years, at a minimum, it has decided that the building industry's role in climate change is something that belongs outside the responsibility of architecture itself? That's the problem. And that we continue to see climate change and architecture itself as opposed. So they're not opposed. We just haven't looked in the right places. Like if we go back to the Bonaventure building in LA, they are not opposed. Jameson told us to look over here, and the connection was in fact over there. So we just need to look more. That's a long answer to your question, but that's the best I can do.
Okay, so if there's no other questions, thank you, Sylvia, for joining us, and everyone for joining us this day. And yeah, happy holidays to everyone, and see you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Hope I get to see your gallery sometime soon.
Yes, absolutely. I will mail you. Ciao.
Bye.